Lately, I've been creating a lot of tutorials on Spring Security. In those tutorials, I've used an in-memory user to authenticate with. This is great for demos, but not really an awesome solution in the real world. So what we're going to do today is move away from that in-memory user and talk about how we can store users in a database. Welcome back, friends. My name is Dan Vega, and I'm a Spring Developer Advocate for VMware. As I mentioned, we're going to move away from that in-memory user today, and what we're going to do is create a new project. We'll include Spring Web, we'll include Spring Security, and we'll talk about this class that we have called the JdbcUserDetailsManager. Similar to that in-memory one, but this gives us the ability to store our users in a database. So I'm really excited about this. Again, a lot of the tutorials I've been working on lately have been Spring Security related, but I get a lot of questions like, this is great, Dan, this is a good start, but I need to do this or I need to do that. And you know, this has been with intention. We got to establish a baseline of what we're doing here in Spring Security, and then we'll start to say, well, for the situation that you're in, maybe you need to do that. So that situation that you're in today, you're probably not using an in-memory user. You want to store users in the database, but you don't want to create the entities by yourself. You don't want to write all the SQL that goes along with that. This is what that's going to give you. It's going to give you all of that right out of the box, and I think you're really going to enjoy this. As always, all the links to anything that we're going to talk about will be in the description below, along with the GitHub repository with all the code that we're going to go through today. So what are we waiting for? Let's start writing some code. All right, we're going to get started as we always do at start.spring.io. I am using Java. I am using the latest stable version of Spring Boot, which is 2.7.3 at the time of this recording. We're going to fill in some metadata here. I'm going to say dev.danvega. We're going to call this JDBC users. Everything else looks good. We just need a couple dependencies here. We're going to use Spring Web, and we're also going to bring in Spring Security. That should be enough. I'm going to go ahead and hit generate, and that will go ahead and download me a zip. And I'll go ahead and open this up in my favorite IDE, IntelliJ. You can open it up in whatever text editor or IDE you're most productive in. All right, I have the application open here. I'm going to go ahead and start by creating a new configuration package. So let's say package config. In here, I'm going to create a new Java class, and we're going to call this security config. And I'll go ahead and mark this as @configuration and @enable web security. Again, this is something we've been doing a lot in recent videos that have been created. If this looks new to you, if you're used to kind of extending the web security configure adapter, I will go ahead and link to a video below that you can watch on some of the changes that we made in the security configuration. But what we're going to do here is to make this happen, we're going to register a bean of type security filter chain, and we'll call this security filter chain, and that is going to take in our HTTP security as an argument. And what we're going to end up doing is returning http.build. And here's where we're going to go ahead and kind of customize our security. So I'm going to start with authorized requests. And what I want to do in here is I'm going to go ahead and pass auth. And I'm going to say, oops, auth. And then we can come down here and say any request we want to go ahead and be authenticated, right? So we want to be authenticated for any request. This is going to have to throw an exception. And then let's go ahead and add a form login so that when we go ahead and visit a particular route, we're presented with a nice form login. And we'll say with defaults, and I'm going to make that a static import just to clean things up. And then we go ahead and build that, and that is what we return. So that's a good start. That will kind of lock down any request. So what I want to do is go ahead and set up a controller so we can have a request to authenticate against. So let's go ahead and create a new package. We'll call this controller. In this controller package, I'm going to create a new class called home controller, just a simple one. We'll mark this with that REST controller. And then what I'm going to do is create two methods in here. We'll say public string home. And this is going to return hello world. And this is going to be a get mapping, so that will be at the root context. And then what I'll do is create one more, And this will be for /admin, which we are going to come back to a little bit later. But while we're here, we can go ahead and set this up. So I'll just return hello admin when I'm in here. So that is everything that we should need to get started. If we go ahead and run our application here, what we're going to see is it starts up, but it also generates this password. So by default, anytime that you kind of introduce Spring Security, Spring Boot is going to set up a default user for you with the username of user and this randomly generated password. And the reason we do this is we don't want you to end up taking this to production with some username and password that could be Googled. So I'm going to go back to the browser and go to localhost 8080. And you see, no matter what route I go ahead and try to hit, it is going to reroute me to the login page. That is what we get when we use the form login security configuration. So, as I said, default user is user and that randomly generated password. And you can see we are now authenticated. So far, nothing new, right? Now, what I want to do is go into my security configuration and do something that we would have done in the past, just to kind of show the progression in case you're new around here. I'm going to go ahead and use an in-memory user details manager. We'll call this users. And in here, I'm just going to return a new in-memory user details manager. Rolls right off the tongue. And what we're going to do is we'll use this user.withUsername. And so we'll pass in a username. We'll say Dan. We'll say password is going to use password. We're going to use a roles of admin so that they have access to that admin route. And then what we'll do is we'll go ahead and build that. So that will give us everything we need to have a user with the username of Dan and a password of password. All right, so now that we have this new user, we just need one more thing, one more setting here. And what we're going to do is enable method security, because even though this user has a role of admin, we haven't done anything to this admin route to kind of lock it down to someone with an admin role. So what we can do is say pre-authorized, we'll say has role, and they should have a role of admin. So with that in place, we have a new in-memory user. So again, this is not something you do in production. This is really done for demos and kind of proof of concepts. But now that we have that in place, we can come down here. Let's rerun our application. And the first thing we should see is that there's no user-generated password in here because we've overridden the default. We now have a username of Dan and a password of password. So let's go here. It's going to ask us for a username and password. We're going to say Dan and password. And it's going to say, nope, I don't think I like that. So let's see what's going on here. Okay, we have to set up a password encoder here. So I'm going to say no. Let's go ahead and rerun this. And Dan and password. And there we go. So we are able to go there. Now we should be able to go to /admin as well. And we are. So far, so good. This is, if you've been watching some of the latest security videos that I've been doing, we've done this a lot, right? So now, the whole premise of this the entire time has been, let's start with the bare minimum. And as we kind of start to work through these, we'll start to add on to it. Like we know that in-memory user details manager is not something we're going to use in production, but let's start to introduce something that we might use in production. And so we might store our users, passwords, groups, authorities, all of that stuff in a database. So the next progression of this is I want to talk about this user details manager. So if you look at user details manager, it implements something called the user details manager and the user details password service. If we look at the user details manager, if you're new to IntelliJ, most IDs or text editors can do this. But if you look over here, it will show you which implementations there are of user details manager. So we've used the in-memory user details managers, but there's also a JDBC user details manager. And this is JDBC user management service based on the same table structure as its parent class, Jdbc Dao Implementation. So there's a whole bunch of stuff going on in here. We're not going to look at every line of this. This would be a very long video. So there's all the SQL needed to insert, update, delete, users, groups, authorities, etc. There's a whole bunch of really useful methods in here. Things like loading a user by a username, creating users, deleting users, etc. So this is the helpful class that is going to give us all of that functionality without us having to do it ourselves and without us having to create a schema. So now this is the important part. It's based on the same table structure as its parent class. Now, if we look at JDBC Dao implementation, there is at the top of this, public static final string, default user schema DDL location. So you could go ahead and grab this user DDL if you wanted to. If you're in IntelliJ, you can do Command-Shift-O, look for a file called users.ddl, and there it is. And you can see it's just a basic schema with the table users and authorities. So you could copy this, you could create it in resources, schema.sql, and that would work. But there's an easier way because this is a static string where that DDL is. We can go ahead and use that. So let's talk about how we can go ahead and make this happen without using this in-memory user. So the first thing that we're going to need is a database. And to do so, I'm going to go into the POM. We could have done this right from the get-go in the start.spring.io. But I figure I'd just show it here. So I can come in and say dependency. I'm going to look for H2. I'm going to use this in the scope of runtime. So I'm going to say this is a runtime scope. And I'm going to go ahead and reload these changes. Once that works, we know that's good to go. I'm going to come into application.properties and I'm going to do a couple things. I'm going to go ahead and set the data source name to dashboard. I'm going to set the generate unique name equal to false. And I'm going to set the H2 council, H2 enabled. I want to enable the H2 council. So that is true. So let's go up here and talk about this. So I'm going to create a new bean. And this, instead of in-memory user details manager now, is going to be the JDBC user details manager. So let's just call this users again. And what we want to do here is return a new JDBC user details manager. And actually, let's go ahead and, because we're going to do some things here, let's go ahead and extract this into a local variable. And we'll just return JDBC User Details Manager. So if you look at this JDBC User Details Manager, there is a constructor that takes in a data source. So we need a data source to pass in here. Now, when we set up these properties here, like data source name, like generate unique name equals false, when H2 is on the class path, we know that we're setting up an H2 embedded database. So what happens is a data source bean gets created for us. So what we could do is we could come in here and say data source, and we can go ahead and pass that in here if we wanted to. This doesn't like that. I bet you I pulled some weird data source in. You know what? I think I probably forgot. So again, we started with just the web and the security. We do need to bring in something else here. Spring boot starter data JDBC. Let's go ahead and bring that in. We need the relevant bits in there, which will give us what we need. So let's see. Yes, so that is going to clear that up. Okay, so what that will do is set up, let's just start there. So what I want to do is start the application and then be able to just kind of look at the database and make sure that that schema gets created, which it's not going to, but just as a little teaser. So let's go ahead and rerun this, and we're going to have to fix a couple of problems here. But everything looks like it started fine. Let's go to localhost 8080 H2 console. Okay, and so here's our first problem. So right now, we don't have any users. And to be honest, I don't want the H2 console locked down. It's not going to be used in production. It's only used in development. And I want to just be able to hit that without being authenticated. So how can we fix that? Well, one thing we could do is we could come in here and say, hey, on our ant matchers, I want you to go ahead and look at H2 console, and I want you to go ahead and permit all. So that would be your first thought of kind of fixing that. There's actually two other small things you need to do to make this work. And it's something I knew about, but I forgot, and then I had to look it up. So the first thing you need to do is CSRF. You need to set ignoring ant matchers to the same thing. So H2 console ***. And then you also need to set headers here. So we'll say headers dot.frame options dot same origin. So if you forget this and you go to H2 console, it'll load, but then you'll see a bunch of like nothing. And that's because you need to set this headers. So with that in place, we should be able to get to our H2 console now without authenticating. Let's try that. Okay, so H2 console. Okay, so good. So we're here. The name of our data source was dashboard. So if we go in, okay, we are able to get into our database, but there's no tables or columns. Something's not getting created, right? So again, I said, if you wanted to, you could come in here and say, create a new file called schema.sql and go ahead and find that schema that is part of that JDBC Dao implementation. But that's kind of a pain in the butt, right? So what I can do here is I'm going to get rid of this, and I'm going to create my own data source bean. And then what that will allow me to do is configure a couple things. So again, I'm going to come in here and say bean. So I'm going to say data source. And what we'll do here is we'll return a new embedded data source configure. Nope, I want a builder. Data source database builder. That's what I'm looking for. And in here, we're going to set the type to H2. What we're going to do is we're going to set the name. So I'm setting the database name to dashboard. And here's where it gets fun. So I can go ahead and add a script. So we know that, again, if we look at here and JDBC Dao implementation, there is a static string for default user schema DDL location. So let's use that so we don't have to kind of copy paste. So let's say JDBC Dao implementation dot default user schema DDL location. So that will load that. And then we can just say build. So we are going to return a new embedded database builder. Whoops. Yeah, let's fix that. Okay, so that will give us the data source. So now that will override the original data source bean, and now that is what will get passed into here. And so let's go ahead and rerun this, and I think we should see some progress now. We should be able to log into the H2 console again, and this time I think we should see our tables and our columns, and we do. So we go ahead and do that. We have select star from users. We have username, password, and enabled. If we select star from authorities, we have a username and an authority. So far, so good, looking good here. Now what we need to do is get some users in there. So we can do this in a similar fashion to how we did in the in-memory user details, right? What I want to do is create a new user. So I'm going to say user, nope, I don't want user builder. I just want user builder. And what we'll say is username is going to be admin. We'll change it up. Password is going to be password. Roles we want to set as admin, and we want to go ahead and build that. So now that we have a user, we can use the JdBC UserDetailsManager to create one. So we can create a user, and we'll go ahead and pass in that admin. Did we not call him admin? Okay. Let's go up here. We need to introduce a local variable. Let's call this admin. So now we create that user, and then we go ahead and return this. So let's once again go ahead and restart this application. Head over to our H2 console, and we'll look at dashboard. We'll look at users, and great. We have a username of admin, a password of password, and that user is enabled. And if we look in authorities, we have admin has a role of admin. So far so good. We're moving right along, doing exactly what we wanted to do. One thing that I see a problem with there is we are storing plain text. We don't want to do that. I'm going to create one more bean in here of type password encoder. We'll say password encoder, and I'm going to return a new bcrypt password encoder. So you could go ahead and encode this password from the command line if you wanted to. For this purpose, if you look at the Spring CLI, there's actually a way to encode passwords using bcrypt, and I believe I've done a video on that. So we'll see if we can find a link for that as well. So I'm going to say password encoder, and let's just say encoder.encode, and we'll say this is my super secret password $12344 whole bunch of characters, right? Okay, so that should be that. Let's just print this out. I want to see what this looks like. Let's say sout admin.getPassword, and let's go ahead and run this again. So we should see an encoded version of this password, which we do. If we look in the database, we see the encoded version. That's good. So I'm going to copy this, and then our username is admin. So let's try and visit just the root. So admin and then that password. Great. And then we try to visit the admin URL, and we are able to get to the admin URL. So cool. I think that was a nice progression. One thing I just want to mention again is the JDBC, where are we? Jdbc UserDetailsManager. There are a bunch of methods in here. Take a look at this structure. If you need to create a user, update a user, insert, delete, change password, find out if the user exists, create a group, add user to, all the things that you would need to do with user management is here. Now, the one thing I will say is this works if you don't have a table structure in place for users. If you have an existing application and you need to use an existing structure, you'll need to modify a lot of things here to fit that. Now, I would say, too, if it's much different, then you may not want to use this approach. You may want to create your own entities. You may want to create your own user details service. And those are things that we'll look at. Again, we're kind of just going down this road of progressing and things that you might do in your application. So I think that's where we'll leave it. I hope you found value in this. If you did, please go ahead and leave me a thumbs up, friends. Subscribe to the channel. And as always, happy coding.